Shalom, brothers and sisters. My name is Yeshaya Yisrael of the tribe of Dan of the nation of Israel. Giving honor and due respect unto the Most High, the Creator and the Maker of heaven and earth. This particular teaching here is due to the fact that there are people deeming themselves to be Christians who attempt to, in their own way, to try to go against the house of Israel. And as been pointed out in my book, when you find these people who are Christian apologists, if you will, they're doing it to keep Christianity alive. Black people cannot lay claim to being the children of Israel when the Torah in Exodus chapter 4 verse 22 says, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Because then where does Jesus fit in at? So in the mind of the average Christian, saying that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God and Son of God, and then you have these black people claiming to be the children of Israel, who the Torah says is the Son of God in the book of Exodus, chapter 4, verse 22. Christians find that as a paradox, and therefore they must try to get at or try to take their feelings out against the Israelites. There are many Israelites who are friends with me who deem themselves as messianic. They all know I am what they deemed as non-messianic. That is not something that I bite my tongue in cheek about. I am what you call an Old Testament-based brother. Regardless of any channel you may have ever seen Maury Yeshaya or Kashub the Danite on, you will always see my citations and quotes once it comes down to the Bible for edification purposes being made out of the Old Testament. Why do I emphasize that is this? The Most High God, Yah, the Creator and Maker of heaven and earth, spoke to the prophet Moses, who was an Israelite. And in speaking to the prophet Moses, we get a record called Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter. In Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter, we read about the aspect, as we explained before on this channel, about the Most High sending Israel back to Egypt again in ships. We already went over and over about the aspect of Mizraim, not meaning Egypt, but meaning double straits or double distress, or distress being doubled. Okay? So this is something, brothers and sisters, we want to point out for edification purposes. They did not expect people to know Hebrew. There are black Christians who will cite Jewish rabbis like Rabbi Meza and others to try to use them to try to combat against the quote-unquote black Hebrew Israelites. And so now when, not to be haughty, when a black man happens to know, let's just say a little bit of Hebrew, responds back, there's no response to such. When I was on Maccabees TV, much respect to the brother Daniela, much respect to my brother and friend Hashar, much respect to my brother and friend who runs that channel. We did a presentation back in 2016 called Smash of the Synagogue of Satan. And in that particular presentation, I expounded upon the meaning of Mizraim. In a later presentation called Israelites Respond to Rabbi, which I can put inside of the description of this, I expounded and shown a bit more deeper about the definition of the word Mizraim, and went basically like clip to clip exposing or expounding upon how the Jewish man is incorrect when they attempt to, in linguistics, go against the house of Israel. Because as one of their rabbis have said, if these black guys knew Hebrew, see, you, like the spirit of Esau, in the book of Obadiah, it says, the pride of your heart hath beguiled you. You may have thought that no N-word, because that's really what you want to say, to be candid, because the word nigger is essentially defined, should I say, as a slothful, and ignorant person. So when you say these black guys or these black Israelites don't know Hebrew, what you're saying in truth is these niggas don't know any Hebrew. But brothers and sisters, this is not to play holy than thou or haughty or anything of that sort. When you're dealing with the Most High God, there's always one or two or many that is always prepared by the Most High for a particular duty. Saul did not know that his replacement was already there while he was still on the throne. Abraham did not know that there was going to be a ram in the bush. You understand? So this is something, brothers and sisters, we want to point out for edification purposes. Never sleep on the work of the Most High, and never let nobody slow you down in your work that you're doing for the Most High. The matter with Munter, this presentation is due to the fact that many attempt to use a Roman historian to state the Israelites have no claim to Deuteronomy 28 verse 68. This claim is made by Christian apologists. Next slide. The matter regarding Munter the historian, it says this. Munter, Roman historian. Now that Batar had been captured, everything came under human control, while Palestine, Judah, was reduced to a desolate mound. Captives were sold into slavery in numbers too great to count. First, they were brought to the grand annual market at the Terebinth Elo tree in Hebron, or in the words of Hieronymus, to the tent Ohel of Abraham near Hebron. Each slave sold for the price of a horse. Those captives who were not sold there were brought to the marketplace at Gaza, which, because of the great multitudes of slaves who were sold there, were called Hadrian's marketplace. And those who were not sold there were herded into ships and were taken to Egypt. Many died in transit, whether by starvation or by shipwreck, while many were killed by cruel masters. Munter, Primordia, ECCI, Encyclopedia, or ECCL, Africane, page 85, footnote 113, or 85th note. This is something, brothers and sisters, we want to point out for edification purposes. Let's read this again. Munter, Roman historian, and I want to pay close attention to certain things. He says, now that Batar had been captured, everything came under human control, while Palestine, Judah was reduced to a desolate mound. Captives were sold into slavery in numbers too great to count. Let's remember that. First, they were brought to the grand annual market at the Terebinth Elo tree in Hebron, or in the words of Hieronymus, to the tent Ohel of Abraham near Hebron, each slave sold for the price of a horse. Those captives who were not sold there were brought to the marketplace in Gaza, which, because of the great multitude of slaves who were sold there, were called Hadrian's marketplace. Let's remember that. And those who were not sold there were herded into ships and were taken to Egypt. Many died in transit, whether by starvation or by shipwreck, while many also were killed by cruel masters. So let's look at this particular part right here, brothers and sisters. Now that Batar had been captured, that means the particular place, a city, a town, if you will, was captured and kept by the Romans. Right? Everything came under human control, while Palestine, Judah, was reduced to a desolate mound. Captives were sold into slavery in numbers too great to count. First, they were brought to the grand annual market at the Terebinth Elo tree in Hebron, or in the words of Hieronymus, to the tent Ohel of Abraham near Hebron, each slave sold for a price of a horse. Those captives who were not sold there were brought to the marketplace in Gaza, which, because of the great multitude of slaves who were sold there, were called Hadrian's marketplace. And those who were still not sold there were herded into ships and were taken to Egypt. So let's see. We see first, we see where the arrow is. First, They, speaking of the Israelites, right? First, they were brought to the grand annual marketplace. Then he goes on to say, those who were not sold there at that annual marketplace, right, were brought to the marketplace in Gaza. So one place being Hebron, which is not the same city as Gaza. Gaza is west of Hebron. Hebron is east of Gaza, which because of the multitude of slaves who were sold there were called Hadrian's marketplace. Hadrian came to power in 117 to 138 CE or AD. That's important. Hadrian came to power in 117 CE, or said by some as AD. So there's three different things going on within this paragraph. You see here, divided into two paragraphs here. See, first, then it talks about the aspect of Hebron in that particular regard. Then it talks about Gaza. Then it talks about those herded into ships taken to Egypt. So you got the Hebron aspect, the Gaza aspect, and then those taken to Egypt aspect. Let's remember those are three different aspects that this historian is talking about for edification purposes. Let's go in Israel. In the above cited text is used frequently against the quote black Hebrew Israelites. The Roman historian Munter, if he is read correctly, does not denounce the claim made by Israelites today, but rather he says the following. Let's go in. The matter of Munter, read carefully. Now that Betor had been captured, everything had came under human control, while Palestine, brackets Judah, was reduced to a desolate mound. All right? He says, captives were sold in slavery, too great to count. First, they were brought to the grand annual marketplace at Terebinth Elo tree in Hebron. Each slave was sold for the price of a horse. Those captives who were not sold there, that we see where the arrow is Hebron. The captives that were not sold there, that was first brought to Hebron, those who were not sold in Hebron, were brought to the marketplace in Gaza, okay, parentheses Gaza, which because of the great multitude of slaves who were sold there was called Hadrian's marketplace. And those who were still not sold there were herded into ships and were taken to Egypt. Many died in transit, whether by starvation or by shipwreck, while many were also killed by cruel masters. Let's go on to the next slide. The matter of Munter, read carefully, part 2. The above citation from Munter is used as stated frequently by them who are against the claims of the quote black Hebrew Israelites. If we read it carefully, it says, first, they were brought, each slave sold for the price of a horse. Those captives who were not sold there were brought to the marketplace in Gaza. Who was sold there was called Hadrian's marketplace. Those who were not sold there at Hadrian's marketplace were herded into ships and were taken to Egypt. Three different things going on. Next slide. The matter of Munter, read carefully, part 3. The quote from Munter states emphatically that of the people taken, they first were brought to a place, grand annual marketplace in Hebron. Then Munter goes on to say, they who were not sold there, meaning sold in Hebron, were brought to the marketplace in Gaza. Then Munter goes on to say, they who were not sold there, meaning now in Gaza, were herded into ships and were taken to Egypt. I want to emphasize that there were three different things, three different aspects. The situation in Hebron, the situation in Gaza, and the situation with those herded into ships and taken into Egypt. Next slide. The matter of Munter, read carefully, part 4. I have to ask, what happened to the descendants of them who were first brought to the place and the descendants of them who were brought to another place? What am I asking in this first question here, brothers and sisters, is this, right? We read about them in Hebron being sold as slaves, and then those who were not sold there were sold as slaves in Gaza. What happened to their descendants of those slaves in Hebron and those slaves in Gaza? See, the reason that becomes important is because you can't disavow those people as ever having children. Because the only ones that we read of being killed in the record left by Munter were those that were what? Herded into ships and taken into Egypt. Some dying of starvation, and some of them were killed by cruel masters. So basically, in the whole aspect regarding Hebron and Gaza, we don't see Munter speaking about them being killed. So what happened to the children, the descendants of those slaves from Hebron and Gaza? Let's go on. The people Munter spoke of may have had children. Slave masters want their slaves to have children so they can have more slaves. Captors want their captives to have more children so they can have more captives. So again, what happened to the descendants of the people that Munter spoke of? That is important. Matter of Munter explained. What seems to happen is that people read Deuteronomy 28 verse 68 and then want to deny what the quote black Hebrew Israelites teach. So they go to Munter and misunderstand history and what Munter was saying. Munter, like Josephus and other historians, were given an account of what they understood of the captivity, enslavement, and diaspora of the people of Israel and Judah. Let's go on to the next slide. Deuteronomy chapter 28 verse 32 and Deuteronomy chapter 28 verse 68. Your sons and your daughters shall be given unto another people, and your eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day, and there shall be no might in your hand. Deuteronomy 28 verse 32. We see that right here. Your sons and your daughters, as in the case of the child here, given to another people, meaning all people in the Holy Bible are not the same. And your eyes shall look and fail with longing, and there's no might in your hand. You can't do anything about it. This is what happened to the descendants of the house of Israel. Christianity cannot answer Deuteronomy 28 verse 32. Your sons and your daughters shall be given to another people, and your eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there's no might in your hand. In your hand there's no might while your children are being given to another people. And the Lord shall send you back into Egypt in ships, by the way whereof I said unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. And there you shall sell yourselves unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Deuteronomy 28 verse 68. Next slide. Deuteronomy 28:68 explained. The matter of Deuteronomy 28:68 explained. Shalom, giving honor and praise to the Creator and Maker of heaven and earth, the Most High. This writing here, based on Deuteronomy 28 verse 68, is because many attempt to state that the Israelites are incorrect in what we are saying. That verse, yes, it is speaking of the Atlantic slave trade, and not of the matter of Titus of Rome. According to some, the verses between Deuteronomy 28 verse 48 to Deuteronomy 28:68 are only in regard to the Israelites and the Romans. Some have said the eagle that swooped down on the Israelites are the Babylonians. One thing to shut that down in respect is the fact that verse 49 says, a nation who you know not. Yet the Israelites knew the Babylonians. Okay, so let's understand that. The exodus of brothers and sisters of the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, all right, shows you that occurring in the 15th century BCE. 200 years before that, you had the people of the Kassites that came up out of the area where Babylon was. The world knew, or their immediate world knew, of what was going on in Babylon and in Egypt and so forth and so on. You understand? So the Israelites knew the Babylonians. You understand? They knew that Abraham came from Ur of Chaldea. And as Ezekiel chapter 23 says, Chaldea is the origin of the birthplace of the nation of Israel. Which, not jumping the gun, when the Babylonian captivity happened, you found Israelites being okay staying in Babylon because they're saying, well, this is where their ancestors came from originally. All right, so this is something we just want to point out for edification purposes. Next slide. The language matter. Another may say that the language which you knew not is speaking of the Babylonians. Yet, the lingua franca of the time when the Israelites and the Babylonians came in contact was Aramaic. Aramaic is the language that the maternal side of the Israelites spoke. Some kings of Israel have Aramaic names. So you can't say that the language that you knew not was Aramaic according to some. People do say that when you read of a language that you knew not in Deuteronomy 28, verse 48 and 49, some people have said that that language that's talking about is Aramaic. But how can that be when you had one of the 12 tribes of Israel that had an Aramaic name, Shimon, said in English transliteration as Simeon? It's not a Hebrew word, it's an Aramaic word. Then you had the kings of Israel of the northern tribes that had Aramaic names, all right? Elah, Zimri, and so forth, all right? So this is just something we want to point out for edification purposes. Because Tigni was one of the kings of the northern tribes. In Aramaic, that means intelligent. But Tigni in Hebrew means, in regards to a female, one who will build. So this is just something that we want to point out for edification purposes if we're dealing in the linguistics matter. The mothers of the Israelites, Rachel and Leah, were Aramean women. They spoke Aramaic. The mother of Jacob, Jacob's mother, was an Aramean woman named Rebecca. All right, so to try to then say that the Israelites maternally came from Aramean women, and then try to say that the language that Israel did not know was Aramaic, doesn't hold much weight. We need to get the studying done, but Christianity is not going to study the Old Testament hard. Next slide. Christian apologists attacked. This must be understood from 3 points: biblical, historical, and lingual. I want to state that the recent attacks online by the Christians to the Israelites in regards to our claim of verse 68 is only to support the religion of Christianity to have a foothold. Next slide. Deuteronomy 28:45 says, "And all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and overtake thee, till thou be destroyed, because you did not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and the statutes which he commanded thee." The fact remains that it says all these curses. Thus, we must read what the curses are to gain an understanding. The claim made that verses 48 to verse 68 is that it only happened to the matter of the Israelites and the Romans. Next slide. Deuteronomy 28, verse 53 says, "And thou shalt eat the fruit of your own body, the flesh of your sons and of your daughters, whom the Lord thy God hath given thee, in the siege and in the straitness, wherein thy enemy shall straiten thee." In the book of 2 Kings, chapter 6:24, we see, "And it came to pass after this, that Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, gathered all his hosts, and went up and besieged Samaria." Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, was besieged. This occurred in the 9th century BCE. We see that the people were besieged and ate their children. When you go to 2 Kings, chapter 6, verse 25 and verse 26, it speaks about one woman saying to the king that they were going to take one son and did boil him and eat him. What is the point of this? Because in Deuteronomy 28, verse 45, in Deuteronomy 28, verse 53, it says about eating the fruit of your own body, the flesh of your sons and of your daughters, in the siege and in the straitness. So looking at it in that particular regard, how can anybody, knowing this happened centuries before the Israelites and the Romans met, Israel and Rome met under the era of Pompey? You understand? The situation with the Arameans was a long time before that. We're talking from the 1st century BCE, all the way from the time of the 9th century BCE. There's over 700-800 years between the Arameans and the Israelites meeting each other in problems, and the Romans and the Israelites meeting each other really at all. This is something we want to point out for reason and purposes. Okay? Next slide. Deuteronomy 28, verse 62. It says, "And ye shall be left few in number, whereas you were as the stars of heaven for multitude, because you did not hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God." So here we see that the people of Israel will be left few in number. In the book of 2 Kings 10:32, we see, "In those days the Lord began to cut Israel short, and Hazael smote them in all the borders of Israel." Again, we see the Israelites cut short, in Numbers, and that is before the era of the Israelites and the Romans. Hazael was the king of Aram. Again, that is before the Israelites and the Romans met. So how can anybody say that Deuteronomy 28, verse 48 to verse 68 is only about the Israelites and the Romans when the prophecies already were coming upon the Israelites prior to the Israelites meeting the Romans? It's the same reason why they didn't study Munter carefully, because they didn't expect people to sit there and read, because Christianity is what is being fought to be kept alive. So when a person is trying to sit there and struggle to keep their faith alive, they will neglect historical facts. They will neglect records that are left. They will neglect the aspect of what the truth of a matter, linguistics of a matter, history of a matter, because they are fighting for survival. And there's no holds barred once it comes down to a person's survival. And Christianity cannot stand if the black man in the West is saying that we are the children of Israel. Next slide. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 63, we see, and it shall come to pass that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to cause you to perish and to destroy you, and you shall be plucked from off the land whither thou goest in to possess it. We see here that the Israelites were told that they would be plucked from off the land they went to possess. Isaiah chapter 1 and Psalm 79 and Psalms 124 says this: Your country is desolate, your cities are burned with fire. Your land, strangers devour it in your presence, and it is desolate as overthrown by floods. Psalm 79 verse 7. For they have devoured Jacob and laid waste his habitation. Then the waters had overwhelmed us, the stream had gone over our soul. Then the proud waters had gone over our soul. The above shows us that the waters in Psalms 124 and the floods and Isaiah chapter 1 verse 7 are nations that Psalm 79 verse 7 have devoured Jacob and laid waste his habitation. So this is something we just want to point out, brothers and sisters, for edification purposes. The besieging that came upon Israel happened before the Israelites met the Romans. Next slide. The point of such a presentation. The point is that all this happened before the time of the Israelites and the Romans. It is the thought of the Christian who comes against the Israelites in the matter of Deuteronomy 28 verse 68 that it all began from verse 48 with the Romans and ended with the Romans. Next slide. The matter explained. If we remember that Deuteronomy 28 verse 45 says, all these curses shall pursue and overtake thee, we can see that it began to happen while Israel was still in the land. Daniel chapter 9 verse 11 says, Yea, or Israel have transgressed thy law and have turned aside, so as not to hearken to thy voice. And so there came, and so there have been poured out upon us the curse and the oath that is written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, for we have sinned against him. So, as we see in the book of Daniel, that Israel was going through the curses that are written in the law of Moses. We explain that the curses began to happen before the Israelites and the Romans encountered each other. Next slide. Deuteronomy 28 verse 64. Deuteronomy 28:63 says the people will be plucked from off the land whether they go to possess. Then in Deuteronomy 28:64 we see, and the Lord shall scatter thee among all peoples, from the one end of the earth even to the other end of the earth. And there thou shalt serve other gods which thou hast not known, thou nor thy fathers, even wood and stone. Brothers and sisters, the European Jews today say that they and their ancestors never worshipped any idols. Yet, the Israelites are known for worshiping idols by reading the book of Jeremiah. So once again, the pride of your heart have beguiled you, like it says about Edom in the book of Obadiah. The Jewish man's claim that we've never served no idols, we've always served Hashem, then you cannot be the descendants of the ancient house of Israel that told the Most High that they will serve idols, that made groves and chapels of idols and wrought abominations in their vessels, as it says in the book of Isaiah. If you're not claiming the sad part of Israel, the undesired part of Israel, such as the idolatry, the harlotry. I'll go so far as to say the adultery and the homosexuality of ancient Israel. If you don't claim that and know that we must repent, then that's a problem. You're just following the religion and not part of the culture. Brothers and sisters, the Most High knew exactly who his people were. And they were not the people that went into Europe and then came back out with a Talmud. His people scattered in bulk to parts in Africa and then were taken across the ocean with yoke of iron on their neck, hungry, thirsty, and naked, and one of all things. That's what happened with the Israelites. The Jewish man doesn't have a history of being put in slave ships or ships going toward enslavement. Other nations have, but not the Jewish people. Certainly black people have that history, even though many people in the so-called conscious community try to deny it. You understand? But you had, to this day, even African leaders who apologize for the slave trade. They wouldn't apologize if they knew that it didn't happen, because nobody apologizes for something that's a lie. You understand? I'll put the information about African leaders apologizing for their people's role in the Atlantic slave trade inside of the description. So this is something, brothers and sisters, we want to point out for edification purposes. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Deuteronomy 28, verse 65. From the plucking we see the Israelites were scattered from one of the earth to the other end of the earth. Then in Deuteronomy 28, 65, we see, and among these nations thou shalt have no repose, and there shall be no rest for the sole of your foot. But the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart and failing of eyes and languishing of soul. So what's being stated right there, brothers and sisters, emphatically, is this. What do you have? Israel was to be plucked from off the land whether they went to possess, in verse 63. Then in verse 64, it says that Israel will be scattered from one end of the earth to the other. That scattering happened by being plucked from off their own land. They were scattered to everybody else's other land. Okay? And then in verse 65, it says, and among these nations. Now I want to emphasize this. And among these nations. Why is it that the Jewish man doesn't answer when I make that claim about us being Israel? And I mention this verse right here. Did they not see the videos? Did they care to see the videos? Did the pride of their heart beguile them and they just say, like Thomas Jefferson did about Sally Hemings, well, I just ignore everything that's being said and everything will go away? No, we're not going to slow down and go away. As stated before on this particular channel, if the Most High gives breath and life, we're going to continue doing and teaching what we've been teaching. Glory to the Creator. We don't serve Adoshem Elokeinu. I don't know who Adoshem Elokeinu is. The name of the God that I come in is Yah Elohim, not Adoshem Elokeinu. So the Most High speaking in Deuteronomy 28, verse 65, and among these nations. Now to the Christian apologists, friends of the Jewish people on the low, once it comes down to being against who they call the black Hebrew Israelites, they may not agree in doctrine about Jesus, but they certainly agree in understanding and saying that the black man, who they call Cushi, and among Jewish people, who they call nigger, among Christian sections, they're united in trying to deny that the true house of Israel is our people. And then they like to say that Deuteronomy 28, verse 48 to verse 68 is only about the Israelites and the Romans. But if such is the case, verse 65 is between 48 and 68. So how do you explain among these nations if you're saying it's only about the Israelites and the Romans? See, Christianity in the Old Testament doesn't work. Next slide. The matter explained. See, so we see it went from plucking to being scattered to worshiping idols to having no rest for the sole of your foot. The no rest for the sole of your foot means one is a nomad. You are always moving about. This being after the plucking and the scattering happened. The people who say Deuteronomy 28, verse 48 to verse 68 is only about the Israelites and the Romans do not explain why verse 65 says among these nations, plural. The book that explains this matter, available online except for on the holy days. That's to say, when the holy days come up, inclusive of the Sabbath, the Shabbat, you cannot get this book. However, online with my blessing, because I take the book down from sales then. You understand? I can be reached at 908-587-4841. For anybody who cares to have an autographed copy of this book, it's $20. The information in it is agreed by some, agreed by many, disagreed by some, disagreed maybe by many. You understand? But it's in due love and respect to the Most High that that information is presented. What we went over in this PowerPoint is part of the conclusion of this particular book. So, if you care to patronize, it will be appreciated. And there's not one person, and this book came out a year and a half ago. There's not one person who bought the book that can say that they didn't get it in a timely fashion. And if it wasn't mailed to them in a timely fashion, I contacted them. So they can never say they never got a tracking number. They can never say that I wasn't keeping in contact if there was something going on wrong with the mail. Because as Israel, we are told not to deal forcefully with your neighbor. The laws is what we have to return back to, such as knowing how to deal right one with another. Shalom. Giving honor and praise to the Most High. My name is Yeshai Israel, 908-587-4841. Signing off. Shalom.